John Irving, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you.
Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
So you wrote a new introduction to this edition, the 40th anniversary of The World According to Garp, and you write, this 40-year-old novel isn't out of date, but it should be. So a two-part question for you. Why should Garp be out of date, and why isn't it?
Well, it's a novel about sexual hatred. A mother is killed by a man who hates women. Her son is killed by a woman who hates men. It was a novel I wrote, both angrily and comically, I thought, protesting that the women's movement had been stopped, had not gone as far as it could have gone, should have gone. Sexual liberation, so-called, had still left us with hatred between the sexes, hatred of sexual difference, intolerance of sexual differences. And I even imagined, as I was writing this novel more than 40 years ago now, that it would be out of date before I finished it. It seemed to me that the kind of sexual discrimination I was writing about was truly too backward to last. Well, I was wrong. Things may be better, but in many areas of the world, in my birth country, the United States included, women are still treated as if they were sexual minorities. And from the sympathy I've always felt for women being treated as sexual minorities, I recognized that smaller, actual sexual minorities, gay men, lesbian women, transgender men and women, were treated even worse. I'm dismayed that sexual intolerance is still tolerated 40 years after I was writing about it. But it is. So that's why I say, it's not, to me, entirely good news that The World According to Garp is still relevant, and why I say it should be a period piece.
Yeah, it reminded me of, I don't know if when you saw the coverage of the Women's March in Washington or here in Toronto as well. I've said this before on the show, but one of the signs that really stuck out to me was, I can't believe I'm still protesting this shit.
Well, that's exactly right. The novel begins with a woman, Garp's mother, being sexually assaulted in a movie theater. And guess what? No one believes her. No one believes that she was really assaulted.
Do you see other parallels between this now in 2018 and back when you were writing The World According to Garp, to the time?
Well, there's certainly no end of hatred or intolerance of the other, whoever the other is perceived to be. I got my politics from my mother. What passes for my social conscience came from her. And my first coming to a political point of view was being aware of sexual politics. Of my 14 novels, 15 if you count the one I'm trying to finish, I would estimate by my own count that not more than 6, 7 of them are what I would call political, or what I would describe as novels with a social conscience, or that take a polemical position toward a certain political issue. And the issues aren't always sexual, but my other interest in politics began with sexual politics. That's where I kind of got into it.
Does it get you down? Does it make you cynical?
Well, I don't know that cynical is the right word. I mean, as a storyteller, not only in The World According to Garp, I've always been interested in worst case scenarios. I've always felt comically and then not comically, that my job is to create characters for whom you empathize and then make terrible things happen to them.
Terminal cases.
Yes.
So, but even now, I mean, given that we just said you're still observing some of the things you saw 40 years ago. I mean, I mean personally, not in your writing. Are you finding yourself able to be hopeful at all?
Well, I have to say, as a writer, I don't know that hopeful is what I do or what I look for as a storyteller. There aren't too many of my novels that have upbeat or what I would call upbeat endings.
Yeah, right.
That's kind of not where I'm generally headed. But I'm dismayed as a political person at how all the bad things in the world don't go away.
Yeah.
That is dismaying. Fascism and xenophobia aren't new, but sadly, I'm not sure that the people who are always referred to as Mr. Trump's base in the United States are well enough informed to recognize fascism, narcissism, and xenophobia for what they are. They don't have the history.
I love how often this theme is coming up now. I mean, when we had Margaret Atwood on for The Handmaid's Tale, she said the exact same thing. She said, I thought I was going to be writing about a dystopia here that hopefully would never come to pass.
Right.
Yeah, seems to be a theme. Can we go back a little bit to when you first wrote it? Because I think that this book is about so many things. It's about, it's referred to as fear. I really see it as anxiety. It's about love. But one of my favorite parts of it, just as someone who makes things myself, is that it's about just the difficulty that no one sees of making something out of nothing. Like the challenge of creating work. Was it challenging for you when you go back to write this?
Yes, it was. It was my fourth novel. I had learned something from the experience of writing the first three. Yes. But it was my first novel with a social subject, my first political novel, my first protest novel, as I would describe it.
Yeah.
And it was written at a time, personally, of considerable duress. I was a full-time wrestling coach, a full-time English teacher, and I had two young children. And I was lucky if I got to write for as many as 2 hours a day and not every day of the week. So whatever I think of Garp with hindsight, looking back, however much I'm depressed by the relevance of the subject matter, I'm eternally grateful to it because it is the book that made me a full-time writer. It is the book that eventually enabled me to write 7 hours a day, 8 days a week. It freed me from having to have other jobs. And I never imagined at the time I was writing it that I would ever be self-supporting as a writer. I had no reason to think I would be.
When did you know that that was the case? Like, I'm always so curious, and musicians will often say to me, I remember hearing it on the radio when I was in New York, and I'm from Scarborough, you know? Or I remember hearing my song in LA, and I'm from Winnipeg. Was there a distinct moment where you went, ooh, buddy, this thing's getting kind of big?
You know, actually, I perhaps I'm by nature so pessimistic. I always doubted it. It was a Book of the Month Club selection, which was brand new to me. It was my first bestseller, and even its appearance as a hardcover on the bestseller list seemed dubious to me. And when my editor and my friends in publishing and older, more knowledgeable people said, you can quit your job now. I didn't really believe it. I kept working for another year.
You kept working as wrestling coaching?
I took another job.
Yeah.
Because I thought, well, they don't know what the hell they're talking about.
Right.
People really they're not really reading this book.
Yeah.
And I was terribly disappointed in myself because the next book, the fifth book, The Hotel New Hampshire, was the first book I wrote when I really did have more time to write. I really could have written 4, 5, 6 hours a day. I was coaching full time, but I'd stopped teaching. And yet I realized that I needed to learn how to do this thing. I had never before concentrated on my writing for more than 2 hours at a time. I'd never had more than 2 hours at a time. And I felt deeply disappointed in myself that I just couldn't do it. I'd work for 3 or 4 hours and I'd get distracted. And it wasn't until the next novel after that, The Cider House Rules, my 6th novel, that I finally learned how to extend my concentration span to an 8-hour writing day. And so I didn't really appreciate what Garp did for me until 2 books later.
Is it similar to, outside of the content of the book, is it similar to, again, a musician having a complicated relationship with their first big hit? I often talk to musicians about that. I can't play it took me a long time to learn how to play Stairway to Heaven because I didn't ever want to play it again because it was so big, something like that.
Well, because it was the first book that gave me an audience, because it was for a lot of my readers the first book they came to, and because there are 10 million copies in print, I think. I forget the number. But its actual success has been somewhat overrated. Among my best sellers, it's my 4th. It's down the list. And it's had a longer head start than the books that are ahead of it. A Prayer for Owen Meany is the most widely read of my novels, is my biggest bestseller.
It was the first book of yours I read.
Owen Meany. Yep. The Cider House Rules is the second. A Widow for 1 Year is third. So, and these books are later books than Garp. They haven't had as long to be out there in the various languages I'm translated into. But the one that changes your life is there's a big difference. Ask anybody to be full-time at what they do or to do it part-time, and they'll tell you, I used to complain bitterly when I was writing Garp and those first 4 novels, that ask a doctor, ask a lawyer, what kind of practice would they have if they got to see patients for 2 hours a day, maybe 3 or 4 days a week. It's inconceivable.
Yeah. I think about, writing songs at least. Some of my favorite songwriters, and even like me a little bit on the less level, but, John Prine is one of my favorite songwriters, and he carries around a little notebook where he would write down just a line he heard in the grocery store and then write
All the news just repeats itself.
He would just
It's a great line.
It's a beautiful line.
Yeah, it's a great line.
Gord Downie would do the same thing. Carry around a little notebook in his back pocket. He heard someone say something at the grocery store, at the restaurant, write it down, and then a whole beautiful song would come from it. Was there a germ of an idea that led to The World According to Garp like that?
Well, I always knew that Garp and his mother would both be killed, and that I always knew it was an assassination story.
Really?
And I knew that Roberta, the transgender woman who formerly was a tight end for the Philadelphia Eagles, I knew that Roberta would be the most balanced character emotionally and psychologically in the novel. She's the only one who loves Garp and his mother equally.
This came to you. These things came.
This was the beginning thing that in the world of sexual hatred, the calmest, most likable presence is this transgender woman who's not had an easy time. But she was kind of the moral guidance to the story. She would, I knew, be the principal voice of the epilogue after Garp and Jenny were gone. So there was that concept that to give the role of the peacemaker to the smallest sexual minority in the story.
Right. That's so interesting to me because I feel like in the mid-1970s, I think it's fair to say in the mid-1970s or early 1970s, there weren't many characters like Roberta being written. There weren't many transgender characters being written.
No, there weren't. And Roberta is the one who's lasted the longest for me. Miss Frost, the transgender librarian in One Person, comes from Roberta. Flor, the transgender prostitute in Avenue of Mysteries, comes from Roberta and Miss Frost. So, I haven't created another Garp or another Jenny, but I've created a few more Robertas. She stayed with me.
Why? Why do you think?
Well, it's always the smallest minority that's picked on the most.
Right.
And in the world of sexual minorities, the trans woman, the trans man is the smallest among them. It's not missed on me, for example, that in May of 2016, President Obama recognized transgender people by instructing his Department of Education to insist to schools that a student's gender identity was their own business. And they got to go to the bathrooms of their choice, and their gender identity was not defined by the particulars on their birth certificates or their genitalia.
Right.
That was one of the first decisions that Trump's education secretary overturned almost immediately upon taking office. In October of last year, Trump's Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, ruled that transgender people were not protected from workplace discrimination. And as recently as 2 weeks ago, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services revealed that they were working on a definition of sex defining gender as determined at birth.
Determined at birth,
right?
by genitalia. Yep.
Now, these people in the Trump administration have an anti-LGBTQ agenda across the board. But who did they hurt first? The smallest minority within the LGBTQ group, and that would be the trans community, right? They wouldn't dare try to get away with that against all gay men, all lesbian women. But they're seeing what they can get away with the smallest, most vulnerable group among them. So it is the smallest, most vulnerable that, as a writer, always interested me in, if you want to see how discriminatory or not, if you want to see how tolerant or not people are, look at the smallest minority around and ask yourselves, how are they treated?
It's an interesting time, John, to be an American writer living in Toronto.
Well, I think it's a challenging time to be an American living anywhere.
Yeah.
This month, by the way, having passed the 3-year mark of my permanent residence in Canada, this month I become eligible to apply for Canadian citizenship, which I will.
You think you're going to do it?
Yes, I am. That doesn't mean that I will give up my U.S. citizenship, or I'm not planning to. Principally because I want to vote.
You want to vote in the
I
U.S.?
I want to continue to be able. So my U.S. citizenship matters a great deal to me. I think it's more important to vote than ever. Don't forget that the principal reason that Donald Trump is president is not because he won that election, but because my fellow liberal Democrats, in my opinion, lost it. 6.5 million Democrats who voted for President Obama in 2012 did not show up for Mrs. Clinton in 2016.
I mean, I think that's why you're seeing so much of a get out the vote campaign right now and a conversation around who can vote and who can't vote
Well,
in the midterms.
We'll see what happens.
So why the Canadian citizenship?
Well, my wife is Canadian.
Yeah.
She's been a dual citizen for some time. She has a U.S. and a Canadian passport. And because of my circumstances, when we met now 30 years ago, she moved to the U.S., and the U.S. was our primary residence. I've lived for as many as 4 or 5 months of the year in Canada for 30 years, but I've only been a full-time resident in Canada for the last 3 and counting, almost 4 years now. So I was in a position where I couldn't leave the United States, and so my wife moved there as her primary residence too, and now we're freer to move where we want. And coming back to Toronto was always a part of the plan. As to when we would do it, that was up in the air depending on what the children and grandchildren were doing and those kinds of things.
Congrats, though. It's nice to have you.
Thank you.
One of us.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'll buy you a Neil Young record or something.
Well, that's okay. I got all of them anyway, but some of them need replacing.
I'll see which one you don't have. John Irving, this is an interesting thing to ask because this is an interesting thing I'm going to ask. Terrible things happen in this book. I was reading The World According to Garp partly as a book, and I was listening to it also as an audiobook that I think was recorded by Edison. Judging by the guy who read it, it sounded like a bit of a tape hiss behind it. But some horrible things were happening in this book, and yet I was finding myself sort of chuckling on the subway a little bit, and I was chuckling while going down the street and chuckling while in the line for Tim Hortons. And I found this review from the New York Times from 1978 that said, "Things in this book ought not to be funny. Still, the way that Mr. Irving writes about them, they are. We not only laugh at the world according to Garp, but we also accept it and love it. Rapes, murders, assassination, appendages are lost here." Does that review ring true to you?
Well, to the extent that any review rings altogether true.
Sure.
That's a stretch for me.
Sure.
Okay, I mean,
I only read a little bit of it.
You have to be careful of the reviews you like, because the next thing you know, the same reviewer will be hating you for some other reason. So you should be a little cautious about how you say that. But I understand. I certainly understand what the reviewer says, and I think it's an accurate description. I will always be interested in a writer in making bad things happen, because I think that's at the heart of the most serious storytelling that I loved, and the 19th century novel that made me want to be a writer in the first place.
And that was?
These are Dickens, Hardy, Melville, Hawthorne. These are not happy people
No.
for the most part. And terrible things happen in those stories. I didn't make that up. Terrible things happen in Shakespeare. Terrible things happen in the Greek classical tragedies. These are the things that made me want to be a writer. These very old-fashioned tragedies where the worst imaginable thing happens. Inconceivably awful things happen. I mean, look at the Oedipus plays. For God's sake, what could be worse than?
But I'm not laughing at those on the audiobook, Joan.
No, I understand. But the comic gene, wherever it comes from, I think I learned this best from the persona of my old mentor and first reader of my first novel, Kurt Vonnegut, who was my teacher at the Iowa workshop, who was one of the funniest writers alive and one of the most depressed men I ever knew. And terrible things happened in his novels too. Mm-hmm. But if you have an instinct for comedy, you can't control it. We all know people who try to be funny who can't be funny, and they shouldn't even try. Mm-hmm. But if you are a comic writer, you will be comic, even and perhaps especially at the most awful times, because it may not affect at all the way you behave in real life. If your children are struggling, you're not laughing, but in literature, I've always felt that the better time the reader, the audience, is having right up until the car hits the wall, the more emotionally unprepared they are for the car hitting the wall. Mm-hmm. And so
the more impact
I like the idea of telling a story in a way that makes my audience feel, oh, this is fun. Mm-hmm. This is until it isn't. Mm-hmm. Until it isn't. It isn't as willfully an act of deceit as I may make that sound.
Sure.
And people who've read more than one book of mine certainly know what I'm up to and what to expect. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is you can't help it if you are funny. And, you know, being funny about things that other people think are not funny gets writers in trouble more than writing about sex.
Oh, yeah.
Two things get writers in trouble most of the time: writing about sex and being funny about things that other people in the world don't think are funny. Mm-hmm. Witness what happened to Salman Rushdie with the Satanic Verses. Mm-hmm. He told a joke. It was the joke that brought the fatwa down, right?
Yeah. Is that something?
It's a joke.
Yeah. Something you have in the back of your mind when you're writing, even now?
How could every writer must have that in the back of his or her mind? Sure.
Yeah, and still in your mind in 2018. I mean, there's so much dialogue right now about what do we find funny in 2018.
Yeah, it's and one of the casualties of one of the casualties of there being so much trouble, so much violence, so much hatred in the atmosphere around us. We have to be careful of the instinct to be overly politically correct, which would be extremely down the road detrimental to the best instincts in poetry and fiction.
Oh, yeah, I mean, it bears to mind because when I was reading The World According to Garp, I was thinking, geez, I wonder if you could write this now.
Well, that's a good point.
Yeah.
I think you have to, the good taste police need to be careful to not police too much.
Well, now you're turning it into a miniseries for HBO, or 5 parts?
No, not for HBO. I'm developing it with Warner Brothers Television. Warner Brothers and I are the co-owners of the theatrical rights to The World According to Garp, and we'll see who our distribution production partner is when we connect with that element, which we are still searching for.
That must be fun, though, or at least interesting to be revisiting it yet again, not just with a forward, but for trying to. I'm guessing you're, being involved in the new screenwriting or adapting your work to the screenplay. It's got to be interesting to do.
It's a better format for a novelist, a limited series, a television series. It's a better format for me, especially for a novel the length of The World According to Garp, than a feature-length film. Unquestionably, I'd rather be given 275 minutes than 120 minutes.
Right.
275 minutes is good. That would be a 5-part mini series, which right now is the structure I've given to this limited series. 5 episodes, 55 minutes. I like the shortness of that 55-minute episode. It's very chapter-esque. There is something over the course of a feature-length film that always feels like a sag to me. Mm-hmm. Even 90 minutes, but especially 120 minutes is a long time to not have a break. Mm-hmm. It's longer than a chapter. Mm-hmm. So I like those. I like those 55-minute episodes. They suit me. But with every screenplay or teleplay you write, you have to recognize it's a crapshoot. There's no assurance that anybody will actually make it. I waited 13 years to see Cider House made by the 4th director I worked with.
Mm-hmm. Well, and Garp was made too. Garp was made into a film. What's your relationship with that film now?
Well, I don't dislike it. George Roy Hill was a friend of mine. George asked me to write that screenplay, but I knew that he did not see in that novel the same movie I saw. We talked about it. And I thought, I declined. I stepped away. Steve Teschitz wrote that screenplay because George asked me first, and I said, no, I don't think so. Because I knew he wouldn't do it my way. We would do it his way, and George would have done it his way. He was one of those old-fashioned guys back when directors had a lot more authority than most of them have now. That I was not going to persuade him to do it my way. As I said, we were friends. We knew each other. We talked about it. I did a cameo in the film. I spent a little time on the set.
That's nice.
I looked at audition tapes, but I kept it a certain distance because I had declined to be the screenwriter. And so I felt, if when someone asks you first and you say no, you don't really have any justification to bitch about the results because you could have been a part of it. And I had a similar but slightly different experience with Tony Richardson. I actually knew Tony better than I knew George. With Tony Richardson in the Hotel New Hampshire. Tony asked me to write that screenplay too. In Tony's case, however, I knew that he was simply asking me as a courtesy. In Tony's case, I knew that he wanted to write it himself. So it was an easier decision on my part to say, no thanks, why don't you do that? But in both cases, I declined. I declined more than I say yes.
Right.
In the case of Cider House, I knew even as I was finishing the manuscript of that novel, I saw how to do it as a film. I saw how to do it.
Well, so is there anything you want to make sure happens in this 5-part miniseries that maybe didn't happen in the original film?
Certainly, if I had to put my finger on the principal omission in the 1982 film is I think the character of Roberta is portrayed strictly for laughs.
John Lithgow, right?
Strictly for comedy, which was, in my estimation, with hindsight, a shame, because John Lithgow could have done Roberta the way I wanted to see Roberta done. I wanted to give Roberta a much bigger part. I wanted Roberta to be more the voice of the epilogue, as she is in the novel, than George chose to give her. And Lithgow is such a wonderful actor. He could have done it. So I thought that was a wasted opportunity. But you know, I don't have grounds to complain about the film George made, because he asked me to be involved, and I said no.
You get to hang with Robin at all? Robin Williams?
He's a good guy. I liked Robin. He would not have been I would not have cast him as Garp. I thought he was entirely too saccharine, sweet, nice for the character I had in mind. I'm more on Jenny's side than I am on Garp's in the book, and I thought Robin was too sweet for that character, but that had more to do with Steve Tesch's screenplay,
The writing rather than.
and once again, they asked me first, and I said no.
You've been really generous talking to me about all this. I really appreciate it. It's fun. I'm having a good time.
Good.
In the introduction, you describe giving the manuscript of The World According to Garp to your then 12-year-old son, Colin, to read. Colin's 53 now? Might be 54 now, I guess.
That's true.
Yeah. Why was it important? Take me back there. Why was it important that he read this book first?
Well, it was the first time Colin was old enough to be considered as a reader for one of my books, and it just so happened that when I finished the manuscript of Garp, and he was aware that I'd finished a novel I'd been writing for almost as long as he could remember, he said, well, can I read it? And that put me kind of on a spot, I think. Anyone would have felt immediately that, as I did, that there were scenes, moments, events in that novel, story-shaping events in that novel that are of questionable subject matter for a 12-year-old to read. So I was a little anxious about that, but I, as a liberal in every political and otherwise sense of the word, I would have felt like a terrible hypocrite if I said, no, Colin, you're too young, and there's things here that are totally unsuitable for you. I couldn't imagine saying that. I mean, it wouldn't have been me, and so I kind of felt put in a difficult position, and that a 12-year-old became that manuscript's first reader, which he was an unusual situation. And I look back on it extremely fondly now, because it turned out to be a very positive reading experience for him and for the two of us. But I did have, as I write in this introduction, I did have some trepidation about that moment.
Does he still talk to you about it? Have you spoken to him about it now?
Well, we talk all the time, but we haven't spoken specifically of that of that moment. He knows he was the first reader of that novel, and that novel is dedicated to him and his younger brother.
One of my favorite moments of the new foreword you wrote for the 40th anniversary is you talk about Colin being 14 going on 53 when someone asks him, hey, is your dad Garp? And he says, the book is about the fears of a father, and my father shares those fears. Does that still hold up for you, that this book is about a father's fear?
Well, yes, and I think Colin was the first person to say that about my work, and more generally, it is true of me, I think, that I write about what I fear. There is in every novel, not only in The World According to Garp, there is in every novel something that happens that I am conscious of knowing I hope never happens to me or to anyone I love. There's always such a moment in my novels. And in fact, if there weren't such a part in the novel, if there wasn't something that not only do I hope never happens to me or to anyone I love, but a part of the novel that I'm dreading the actual writing of, that I'm hating the idea of writing that scene or those scenes. If a novel doesn't have that element, I won't begin it, because if there isn't something in it of that nature, I have a hard time imagining that it's good enough to give 4 or 5 years of my life to, and that it will have the desired impact on a reader. If there isn't something that makes me most uncomfortable just to imagine, I have to know that that's in the story.
That's coming in the story. John, if you'll indulge me, just 2 quick questions at the end. You mentioned something earlier that really fascinated me, because I had someone on the show about 6 months ago who hung out with Charlie Chaplin. And one of the things I said to her was, hey, Charlie Chaplin to me is not a real person. He's like Mickey Mouse, He's a creation. I don't see him as a real guy. And she was like, oh, no, he was a lovely guy, he always had a boiled egg, or she told me some kind of stories about him. I have to mention, when you mentioned Kurt Vonnegut, I had the same kind of reaction that, to me, Kurt Vonnegut is, again, Mickey Mouse. He's sort of a larger than life figure to me. Can you tell me, what was he like?
Oh, he was a great guy. He was very kind and generous to me as a younger writer. I was his student at Iowa, but he was always kind to me, a kind of father figure to me. We watched the 6-Day War together because I didn't have a television. I knew him when I lived in New York. He lived not far from where I lived in the city. We saw a lot of each other there. When I lived in the Hamptons, he lived a bicycle ride away. So I was fortunate later in our lives to be his friend too, after I'd written 4 or 5 books. But to have had him as my first reader for the first one was a great kindness to me, a great sort of benefit to me. I really love the guy. In the last years, the later years, he was a little unhappy and not always the sunniest of people anyway. Comic, but pessimistic to his core. And I would often find him sitting on my front porch waiting for me to get up to make coffee in the mornings when I would get up. And one of my kids would always come and say, Kurt is here. Kurt is sitting on the step. And I'd say, well, let him in, welcome him inside. And one time my son Brendan, when Kurt came in, and I'd say, how long have you been here? He said, he'd always say, you always tell me you get up early. You don't get up early at all. And, well, it was like 7 o'clock in the morning, and he'd be sitting on the porch having a cigarette. And one morning, Brendan went out with a cereal bowl, and picked up all the butts around where Kurt had been sitting. He came in with like 8 or 9 butts.
From that morning?
From that morning. And so we tried to piece together in our minds, how early had Kurt been there? We imagined that he must have come when it was still dark. Right. And that he'd been smoking on the porch from 4 or 5 in the morning and until the coffee got made, you know. He was a good guy.
He was right. You don't wake up early.
Well, not that early.
Is there anything you keep with you from them? Like, is there a piece of advice you keep in your back pocket, you know?
Well, sure. It's in one of his novels. Above all, he said, you have to be kind. I buy that. Just as a cautionary word for civilization. You have to be kind. The opposite instinct to threatening to send 15,000 troops to the Mexican border to ward off hungry women and children. Mm. You have to be kind. It's a good principle to follow.
You've been very kind in talking to me today. I appreciate it. 15th novel, by the way, anything you want to say about that?
It's a ghost story. I'm in the last half of it. It's called Darkness as a Bride. And I expect I'll finish it sometime in 2019, and it probably will not be published before sometime in 2020. If I had to guess, it's hard to say.
Well, I'm looking forward to it. John Irving, nice to meet you.
And you. Thank you.
Thank you for coming in.